Zoos and aquariums are home to a myriad of different species. The diversity and complexity of these populations means they are excellent subjects for scientific research. Zoo and aquarium populations are useful for both basic science or pure research, i.e. to add more knowledge to a particular subject, or for applied research, where a problem or question is investigated and then the findings are brought back in to the animal management and husbandry. Zoo and aquarium research can be conducted from any level of college or university students through to PhD, doctoral and higher level academic study. Different types of questions posed by these researchers really allow us to find out more about the needs and requirements of the animals that we're looking after, and can provide us with information that's useful to wild animals too. Here's a great example of a species whereby research in the zoo can tell us a lot more about biology, ecology and behaviour. The pygmy hippo can be tricky to find and track in the wild. It's elusive and occurs in a very complex, heterogeneous environment. Studies on zoo animals, looking at time activity and behaviour patterns, for example, can directly translate into field-based conservation. Other species, like the giraffe, are much more familiar to us, and translation of research out in the wild can be used to inform captive care. And likewise, information that we glean on zoo animals might be useful to conservation planning, population sustainability initiatives, or how to translocate and move animals between national parks. Information that can come from expertise in the zoo. If you'd like to know more about the links between the zoo and the wild, and the wild to the zoo, there is a paper that I have written in the new open access scientific journal Birds about evidence for aviculture, the research needs for ex situ bird populations to advance their conservation relevance and to help with collection planning, as well as areas that zoo birds can feed into wild world conservation action. This paper is designed to review research questions and research extensions that can add value to the reasons why we keep birds in zoos. But this type of approach is applicable to all taxonomic groups. Why do we keep them? What value can we add to them? And how does science allow us to further evidence their husbandry and help us to link the zoo population more fluently to the wild? So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to cover some of the areas that zoo science can help us investigate. What should we research and why should we research it? We can provide evidence for best practice husbandry. We can study behaviour, and from that we can infer animal welfare state. We can look at nutrition in the zoo and how we plan diets. We can understand the effect and influence of visitors. We can manage our breeding programs and ask questions of population sustainability. And we can look at the impact of conservation action, ex situ individual management, and how that enables us to further the breeding aims of these individuals whilst they're housed in captivity. Let's start by looking at evidence for best practice husbandry. This is a flock of Caribbean flamingos, and they're performing their courtship display, an intricate set of head and wing movements that is performed as a group that encourages successful breeding. Evidence from the wild tells us that flamingos need to display in large groups, and they nest in large groups too. This allows them to pick a mate successfully and to feel secure whilst breeding. Zoos that keep the largest flocks of flamingos are the most successful at producing chicks, the evidence from the wild being translated into the group size in captivity. There are many areas of zoo practice that involve a need for husbandry evidence. For example, when we put species together in mixed species enclosures, how do species breed in these enclosures? What are the interactions between the mixed species? Are the interactions positive, negative, or neutral? What resources are used within these exhibits? And how does that impact on the time activity budgets of the animals? Do we see more negative interactions between individual species at different times of the year? Are there different sexes or life stages of the individuals of the species that are mixed that are influencing these interactions? And are the mixes of different species within these mixed taxa exhibits ecologically relevant? Would these species be found together in the wild? Do they have natural abilities at coping and coexisting with the species that are housed together in the zoo? And therefore, what is the long-term impact on individual and population level welfare and population sustainability of the housing of such species in a mixed species exhibit? Husbandry evidence to further develop these mixed species exhibits to make them biologically and ecologically relevant can come from scientific investigation. Behavioural studies are some of the commonest forms of research carried out in zoos. Don't worry, this nilgai antelope is not broken. They often forage and feed like this whilst on their knees. But looking at the time spent foraging in different postures or in different ways enables us to build up a time activity pattern of the animal, and we could potentially compare that to the wild. We can learn a lot about the welfare state of the individual, about the choice and control they have over their environment from observational behavioural studies, the data of which are really valuable. We can also use observational and behavioural studies to look at individual body condition, how they're coping, and why there might be differences in responses to husbandry, in the case of the differences in body condition of those giraffe. Behavioural studies can be relatively easy to start. Perhaps you can do a focal follow in the case of studying the larger of these two hippos, recording data continuously or as a scan sample at different intervals. Or perhaps you would like to do a group scan of counting all of the individuals performing behaviour at specific time points. Either way, you can answer a question that leads to an activity pattern. We don't only calculate time activity budgets. We can also look at social interactions, and we can use social networks analysis to work out the patterning of associations, i.e. how close, in what proximity are individuals from each other, and is this proximity consistent between individuals, as well as measuring interaction patterns. How long, how much, how often does one individual do something, scratch, groom, play, for example, with another individual in their group? To understand the differences between associations and interactions, you can watch the video about associations and interactions on my YouTube page. Some species, like the meerkat, incredibly social animals, lend themselves to social networks analysis studies. Just remember that any form of social study requires identification of individuals in the group. One of the next most commonly investigated areas of zoo husbandry and management is nutrition. Diet influences the behaviour, welfare, growth, aging, development and reproduction of all individuals in the zoo. We must be aware of natural ecology, how the animal would feed and forage in the wild, when planning and implementing diets, be that browse for these giraffe or forage for this tortoise. The gastrointestinal tract of all species, from giraffe to tortoise, has evolved in a particular way to extract nutrients as efficiently and as effectively as possible. Animal welfare and potentially longevity will be compromised if zoo diets do not match wild ecology. Studies on intake and outtake studies, analysis of the diet, often called proximate analysis, understanding amounts fed and how much the animals actually consume are really useful. And for specialised feeders, let's go back to the flamingos, that might use key parts of their diet for other aspects of their life history. For example, the pigment that flamingos have in their feathers comes directly from the foods they eat. This is essential to all aspects of how they organise their social lives and their reproductive lives too. So not only can we see how much they're eating and when do they eat, but we can also see the long-term effects of diet quality by measuring the pinkness of their plumage, for example. Various pieces of software, such as Zootrition, will allow you to do in-depth diet studies and nutritional analysis in the zoo and aquarium. Remember that many animals may forage for food within their enclosures too, and collect food naturally. Many herbivorous species, like the grazing nilgai we saw earlier, how do you quantify what they get from their pasture to that they're provided with in their daily diet? Now there's an interesting question for the future zoo nutritionist. And in some cases, such as for this ring-tailed lemur, plants in the enclosure have been used as enrichment, expanding on the sensory perception of the animal and providing a greater dimension to its environment that it can engage with. But what if it eats these herbs that have been provided for enrichment? How do we quantify that as part of its diet? What's in those herbs that might be beneficial to the animals? Always consider all variables when planning a dietary study so you know exactly what the animal is provided with and what it is consuming. A huge influence on zoo and aquarium animal behaviour and welfare and day-to-day life are the visitors that zoos and aquariums rely on for their income. Without the visitors, zoos and aquariums would not be able to meet their key conservation, research, education or entertainment aims. So visitors are an essential part of the zoo, but we must measure any potential impact on the animals that the visitors have come to see. In this photograph, you can see a paid-for visitor experience, where certain members of the public have paid to feed the zoo's giraffes. This not only enhances the educational value of the giraffe to the visitor, it provides a close social bond between the visitors and the animal, enhancing the animal's worth in the eyes of the visitors, and it's enriching to both parties. But how close do you want your visitors to get to the zoo's animals? Here's a cheesy photo of me and some flamingos, and I use this to illustrate the importance of considering this distance between the human and the animals they've come to look at. The visitor effect can be categorized as positive, i.e. enriching, negative, i.e. potentially fearful or stressful, or neutral, i.e. the animal ignores the visitor. But we don't know this for all species. And certainly there is a bias towards the study of mammals when it comes to the visitor effect. So more work is needed on understanding the responses to visitors and to their caregivers as well, to aquarists and zookeepers, across a wider range of taxonomic groups. This will allow us to plan and design husbandry and management regimes in line with those species' responses. Here's an example of some magpie geese that are being trained for a public display. This is not a circus. The animals are not performing. They're being trained to perform particular natural behaviours on cue to show off their wonderful ecology and evolution to visitors. Magpie geese are sociable birds, so they must be kept in a group. And here you can see these individuals are being trained in a group as well. Understanding the natural behaviour pattern of the animal, the likes and dislikes of the individuals, their preferences and personality traits, will allow for a better human-animal experience and better measurement of any potential visitor effect, be that in individuals that are being on show to the public within enclosures and individuals that are in shows for the visitor too. Some species might naturally seek out attention. Here's an example of two Victoria crowned pigeons and a crested wood partridge. These birds are naturally inquisitive. They've come over to see what's going on. So their types of enclosures, and they are commonly found in walk-through exhibits, need to be designed in a way to educate and inform the visitor on their behaviour to keep the animals safe and away from harm. Nobody wants to accidentally tread on the inquisitive partridge, for example. Zoos and aquariums hold many species that are threatened on the IUCN Red List, such as this delightful baby Asian elephant. Reproduction and captive breeding and conservation breeding for individuals that go back to the wild are key aims of the modern zoo and aquarium. Understanding behaviour and welfare, responses to the environment and diet provided can allow us to improve reproductive rates and the number of healthy youngsters produced in the zoo. And research can allow us to understand some of the management practices that we can use with zoo animals to improve reproductive output. In this photograph, you can see 3 species of flamingo. 2 of these species of flamingo have been involved in a foster breeding activity. The pale bird in the middle is a Chilean flamingo, and the bird with the yellow and black beak next to it is an Andean flamingo. These birds are housed at the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust at Slimbridge. In 2018, the Andean flamingos laid eggs, built nests, and tried to rear youngsters. But sadly, because they are an elderly flock, the eggs were infertile. At the same time that this was going on, the Chilean flamingos at Slimbridge had also laid eggs. So some of the Chilean flamingo eggs were given to the Andean flamingos to rear. This allowed the Andean flamingos to continue a natural breeding cycle, which is enriching for all concerned, and rear their youngsters, even though their youngsters actually turned out to be Chilean flamingos. Research on the wild behaviour of the Andean flamingo and the Chilean flamingo shows them to be incredibly similar, both in behaviour and ecology. So this fostering approach was relevant to both species involved and allowed the Andean flamingo flock a chance to rear their own youngsters, which were then integrated back with the Chilean flamingos. Recording the behaviour of the birds, seeing who was on which nesting site and who had paired up together, allowed the finer details of this breeding event to be captured. This information is really useful should it ever happen again, or should other zoos be in a similar position where one species of bird, or any other animal for example, might be rearing youngsters but not doing a very good job, and a foster parent is needed. The close relatedness of the flamingos and the fact that they come from a similar environment means that this foster rearing attempt stood a very good chance of success. So research into the birds themselves in the wild, as well as their captive management and their flock dynamic, allowed an applied question to be directly applicable to a future generation and population sustainability initiative. Research into population sustainability and population management is really important. And these are useful research questions to consider when we move away from mammals. Population management for fish, for example, now that's a tricky subject, and again one worthy of future investigation. ZIMS records, the program run by Species 360, can provide really useful insight into the populations of species that zoos and aquariums house. You must always remember to ask permission from Species 360 for use of ZIMS records. Speak to the zoo or aquarium involved if you wish to do a records-based project. Many species of fish don't necessarily breed that well in captivity and might have a wild source to their population. So numerous initiatives are involved at promoting sustainability of freshwater and marine fish whose offspring from such population management programs can be spread around different zoos and aquariums. Again, this is not just about records, and it's not just about population management research, but about behavioural research too. In this photograph, you can see some red-bellied piranha. They've turned black, which is a signal that they're starting to reproduce. The darkening of the fish's bodies and the shortening of the plants in their tank. Piranha chew down tall plants to create an area where they lay their eggs, are clear signs that the fish are ready for reproduction. Understanding these cues can be fed into population management, this knowledge of animal behaviour, to tell others keeping this species what to look out for if they wish to breed them. And sustainability can also be around enclosure design and the furnishings of enclosures too. Here's a mangrove tank. You can see the mangroves, these semi-aquatic trees that live in estuaries, lining the back of the tank. Propagation of such plants, sharing that information on how to propagate them, reduces the likelihood that such plants need to be taken from the wild and makes the zoo and aquarium truly sustainable. We can also think about sustainability in the buildings of the zoo as well. Here's an example of a new aviary that's being planned at a large zoo in France. If we think about the building materials that are used and where they come from, how the animal houses are going to be heated and lit, where the water will come from, how it's going to be sourced, filtered and potentially heated. Where will the plants and planting come from? Will there be native species or exotic species? How is the building designed to last over time? Will it withstand weather and climatic changes? What's the carbon footprint of the transport and human power needed to create this new enclosure? So population sustainability and the design and development of husbandry is not always about the animals themselves, but the infrastructure needed to keep the animals alive. So this infrastructure and the way in which the infrastructure works in the zoo can also be the subject of research projects too. Don't forget the native species too. Many zoos and aquariums are great places for native species to live, and many organisations have nature reserves within, around or near the zoo itself. These are tree sparrows at WWT Martinmere, and the nature reserves that many such organisations run are home to rare, threatened or populations of species that require extra assistance and help. Surveillance, monitoring, counting and understanding the population trends of such individuals and such species, as well as habitat augmentation, are really useful research projects that shows how zoos and aquariums are involved not only with wild animals but also native species too. I hope this presentation has showed you that the modern zoo and aquarium is a brilliant place to do scientific investigation. As we do more and more individual animal management techniques, such as the target training of these individual zebras, so we can ask really directed questions that relate not only to the husbandry and management of the species, but also to the individual of that species too. That tells us a lot more about animal welfare, their responses to the environment, and how suitable their husbandry is for them. We are able to fully understand and evaluate enclosures to look at the individual's response to the enclosures and enact change to that enclosure so it best fits the individual animal. We can also look at population management, the health of the individuals within the population, how well they reproduce, and whether or not that population is sustainable. On top of that, we can consider ZIMS records, the data that zoos and aquariums hold on their individual animals to find out why some populations breed well and others might be more of a challenge. And as we use information from the wild and knowledge of the ecology of our species, so we can build that into captive care. Perhaps we need to provide a particular breeding site with a mirrored background and the use of sprinklers to provide the best substrate for nesting, as in the case of these flamingos. Or do we need to mix up the social group so more animals perform courtship display? If you'd like to know more about conducting research in a zoo and aquarium near to where you live, check out the research section of the BIASA website, where you can find the Handbook of Zoo and Aquarium Research, which will go over all key methods useful to studying zoo animals, visitors, enclosures, and all other aspects of the zoo and aquarium. You can also check out the BIASA Research Committee's Facebook page for a range of useful resources and links to interesting papers too.